upon us does not mean that these conversations will go away. They'll simply take some different forms. And so with that, we welcome your input, your ideas, your contributions, your questions. But I'm joined, as I always am in these conversations, to be led by Malia Lazu. So Malia, over to you.
Thank you. And thank you so much, Fiona. I want to just take a moment to thank you, Fiona, for letting us do this. It's been such a great pleasure. We're on our last one. And it's been a great journey. We are circling up to see what we're going to do in the future and how we're going to continue these conversations. But these last few months, I think, have been really special for all of us to be able to come together and get to know people and the work. And also, shout out also to Fiona, Professor Murray, and Dean Murray, all of those titles. But thank you to even including us in this seminar towards action. When we started in September, we had said that this wasn't just about talk, this was about action. And we now have a class of students working on real-time requests from the LGBTQ Chamber and from the Ben Franklin Institute and Black Market, which are three business advocacy and organizing groups here in Massachusetts. So we have started taking action and we will continue taking action. And so it's great to be on this last one. And I just wanted to mark it, Fiona. So thank you. This last one, we're going in, right? I like to say that, you're doing the work when you're looking in the mirror. And we've been doing a lot of learning, but now we're going to talk about institutions like ours and how we really do make a difference. And we're joined, and Fiona is also going to jump in this one, which is going to be great. But we all are going to have this conversation and to talk about the elite side of diversity. And so let me introduce our speakers. For over 25 years, founder and CEO of Inclusion Design Group, Dereca Blackmon, has consulted with a wide variety of corporate, educational, nonprofit, and community-based groups to facilitate uncommon conversations on the issues of race, gender, class, and social justice. She served for 5 years as the Assistant Vice Provost and Executive Director of the Diversity and Inclusion Office, First Generation at Stanford University, where she introduced groundbreaking work to over 30,000 students, faculty, staff, and alumni on authentic engagement and intergroup dialogue. Thank you for joining us, Dereca. And it's my pleasure to introduce Stanley Litow, a professor at both Columbia and Duke. At Duke University, he also serves as Innovator in Residence. Stan is the author of The Challenge for Business and Society, From Risk to Reward. Amen. He has previously served as the president of IBM International Foundation and as a deputy chancellor of the schools for the city of New York. So thank you so much for joining us in this conversation. And Dereca, I'd like to start off with you. Can you tell us about your work at Stanford and, this inclusion and diversity first gen office, and also how you sort of cut through the fatigue of it all?
Thank you so much. Thank you, Malia. Good to see you, Dean Murray, Dr. Litow, everyone at Sloan and beyond, who is a part of what has seemed from the outside to be an amazing set of conversations. So grateful to be kicking off the very last one. So as has been said, I'm Dereca Blackmon, and I am CEO of Inclusion Design Group. I use she and they gender pronouns. I always want to start with my pronouns because I like to let you know what they are, because you can't tell by looking at me. So the Diversity and First Gen office at Stanford was an amazing opportunity to really look at the specific work that needed to be done to support our first gen and or low income students. Stanford calls them FLI, F-L-I, for first gen and or low income. And as a FLI alum of Stanford, it was my great honor to support students. And then in addition to that, to be doing the diversity education for the campus throughout the entire campus, biz school, medical school, law school, and alumni. And what I learned in that experience is that there was something very specific about FLI students that needed to be addressed. And it was to move beyond access, right? and into real inclusion, to start seeing Fly students as an asset to the university. We talk about Fly students, we talk about BIPOC students, we market them on our business websites, on our university websites, but they aren't taught to see themselves as assets. And so that was a wonderful thing for me to be able to engage in, not only supporting the students, many of whom had come from under-resourced schools, and how to navigate, right? If you're first gen, right, you don't have that extra support in navigating the environment. You may have a mom who worked 3 jobs to make sure that you had SAT prep, right? And this is something, the misnomer of under-resourced means that people worked twice as hard, 3 times as hard to get to the same place that people who had all these opportunities did. So that's traditionally where we've been focused, is how do we prepare the under-resourced? But the other thing, and this is true of the corporations I work with, is diversity is just the fact of the world. Our recruitment, our admissions is just mirroring the fact, those intentions are mirroring the fact of who's available in the world. But inclusion is about opportunity and access once you have folks there. Belonging is about the culture that you create that says to folks, you deserve to be here. No one lowered the bar for you to be here. You're here because you are an asset. And that kind of belonging actually requires training for the people in a corporate culture, for the people in a university, so that they can retrain their thinking about what students are an asset to the environment. Right? These are students who have already been resilient and innovative, who are still making more with less. That kind of thinking is actually more advanced than folks who really kind of just coast and receive. Doesn't mean they're smarter, right? Because that gift crosses all economic areas. That's not what I'm saying. I'm saying there's a certain particular skill that comes from navigating an elite environment with less resources. When I was an undergraduate at Stanford, I was paying my mom's rent, right? That particular skill set is an incredible asset, both at Stanford and in the innovation economy that the students go on to participate in.
Dereca, thank you so much for that. And thank you for laying out how Stanford, really looked at building value and acknowledging value. And, Stanley, you're doing something, really just unique and innovative over at Duke with your innovators in residence. I would love for you to tell us about that and about this model for the university and how you're using your position to really make change.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to join you today. I'm going to cover 3 things with you in response to that. At Duke, we are planning a new, relatively innovative executive education course for corporate leaders to use the talent and the skills that we're able to amass to be able to help people in the private sector to figure out what corporate social responsibility is all about, how it connects to the business bottom line, and what kinds of actual learnings they need and what behavior can they adopt to change what they're doing. In the area of diversity and inclusion, many companies have started to make pledges about their hiring practices, which is well and good, but they also need to focus in on their governance practice. How is diversity part of how the institution is governed? How is the training set up for diversity and inclusion so it goes beyond hiring into everything that the private sector does? How do you focus in on not just entry-level hiring, but executive promotion and leadership opportunities? It's great to have companies making commitments to hire more people who are diverse, but then they have to look at their executive workforce. A company like Microsoft, great, making pledges about hiring, but only 2.6% of their executives are Black. So that's not something that people are going to sit back and wait 10 years for. They're going to have to learn and absorb the kinds of changes that they have to do. And what about their supply chains? Companies don't only do their own business, but they work with suppliers. And many signed a pledge to have at least $1 billion out of their supply chain going to women and minority-owned business. What do we learn? What does the research tell us? That within 2 years of a minority-owned company getting a contract with a large company, they double their workforce. So that power and that ability of private sector organizations, they're going to learn at this executive ed program at Duke. And that's something that Duke needs to do as well. And that's why diversity and inclusion is part of the plan at the university, not just to change the university culture, but to make the culture more welcoming for young people with diverse backgrounds. The second thing I want to mention is I'm a trustee at the State University of New York. And if you look at the elite institutions across public higher education institutions, enrollment numbers went down last year as a consequence of the pandemic. And now, why did that happen? Because large numbers of very low income students and students of color not having access to their high schools because they were shut down, they didn't apply, not because they didn't have the skill, not because they didn't have the background. What was the reduction US-wide? 30%. That's the largest one-year reduction from low-income students of color that we've experienced since we've been collecting data. So what did we do different at SUNY? We set up a really hands-on program where we could provide singular person-to-person guidance for students to turn those enrollment numbers around so that the pandemic would be an anomaly for 1 year and we would welcome them into the elite institutions within a public higher education system. And the third and last thing I'll mention is that in our K-12 systems, and as you heard, I was deputy chancellor for the largest K-12 system in the United States, the New York City Public Schools. Many of our schools have become a lot more segregated than they ever were before. And that happens because there are barriers to entry into the most effective and elite kinds of high schools, barriers based upon exams or grades. And one of the things that I did at IBM is started an innovative program called PTech. It's not a grade 9 to 12 high school. It's a grade 9 through 14 combined high school and community college. And it launched 10 years ago with one school across from a public housing project in Brooklyn. And now there are 260 of those schools across 12 states and 28 countries around the world. And the data shows us that their college completion rates at PTech schools are 400% higher than the national average because there's no barrier to getting into the PTech schools. So for example, one young man who I know well, Oscar Dadilla, was more than 3 years behind in grade 8 in reading and math and thought he would never graduate from high school, got into the PTech school across from Albany Houses, completed the 6-year program in 3.5 years, got a full scholarship to Cornell. And he's an example of dozens and dozens of students. Right. If you eliminate the barrier, and I've just written a new book coming out called Breaking Barriers, published by Teachers College Press, that shows that these barriers that keep students out based upon supposed lack of educational performance really are leading to a less diverse culture in all segments of society. And by breaking the barriers and gaining that entry, we have an opportunity not just to help the elite institutions like Duke, Columbia, MIT, Stanford, but to make sure that young people really have an opportunity for real success because they can succeed if we believe every child can succeed and give them the support to be able to do that.
Thank you. Thank you. And what I like about what both you and Dereca are saying is that, you know, this idea we so often think about like, oh, well, they didn't make it, you know, white hegemony has an idea, you know, becomes like the norm and the right. So it's like, oh, well, they don't have the skills and all of that. And here at MIT, we talk about lost Einsteins, right? And how there's Einsteins in every neighborhood. They just don't know that they're Einsteins, right? They don't actually get the ability or to be those prodigies or to be whatever they may be. And Fiona, I would love for you to talk about what we're tackling here, you know, at Sloan and how you and Ray have decided to come in and change the institution.
Great. Well, thank you, Malia. And I just have to just take this opportunity when we talk about that. And there's this really amazing piece of work that's actually been done by folks out of Stanford and Harvard and elsewhere, really looking at this. And they talk about lost Einsteins. One thing that troubles me occasionally is I feel like we ought to call them, some of them at least, lost Marie Curies, lost, Marion
Amen.
Donovans. And
right.
So every now and then we just sort of forget who it is that we've lost on the wayside. So look, I think there are a few things that we're doing. I mean, I think it's very easy, even though the work itself is difficult, to come in to focus on diversity, equity, and inclusion, and to focus specifically and at the beginning in the university on the composition of our student body. Now, I think that's a very, very important piece of work. It's also ongoing work. It's not as if, we haven't been thinking about this for a long time. And I will say that especially in our undergraduate community, I want to give enormous kudos to Stu Schmel and those who run MIT admissions, who have really worked tirelessly. And I think including doing some of the kinds of things that Sam just talked about in terms of engaging with, young women in STEM, with underrepresented minorities, bringing them onto campus to make MIT feel like a place that is accessible to those people who are first generation, and to really think about how people can come and be with us, can be prepared before they get here for the sort of tsunami that is an MIT education. People talk about it as drinking from a fire hose. When you get up to sort of MBAs and what have you, you're already dealing with some really significant challenges, including just the sheer financial burden of deciding to step out of the professional workforce once you've got there and do this, particularly when people often have other responsibilities. And so there's some amount of financial and fundraising work that we need to do to really make sure that there is meaningful access. And there are some things that we often have to talk about because we're trying to judge people coming into a professional program. There's often language around things like, do people have presence and things like that in interviews? And we are working hard to make sure that all those kinds of things, are understood. But actually, for me, more important is taking a systems-wide approach. I mean, MIT is quite well known for thinking about system dynamics. We are ourselves a system, and we are sort of nested within broader ecosystems and systems. And so I don't think any one intervention, and even a series of completely separate interventions, is not going to get us where we need. And you also become exhausted, like you're spinning endless plates simultaneously. So one of the things that we're trying to do at the moment is to have a point of view that we want to share between our students, our faculty, and our staff. So not actually thinking about these as separate groups of people, but in fact people who can come together to kind of support one another. Recognizing first that we are all very, we need to be more objective about our subjectivity, right? We bring our different points of view, but let's understand what those are. Let's understand the kind of biases that we bring to work every single day, as opposed to sort of having bias training that's trying to make them go away. They are a part of how our brain works, but let's be objective about that. Then let's give all of us the opportunity to know how to have more authentic conversations. And this, I think, is a great example of that. And then how do we make sure that we're more consciously inclusive and we bring more diverse people around us? We don't just do the easy thing, which is to create teams on projects with people who are just like us, because that's just more comfortable with fewer frictions. And so how do we push all of ourselves to be more consciously inclusive? And I think if we can do that, to then actually have just this more open and inclusive and kind of constructive culture. This is not about all of us trying to say, we're all the same, or we even share all the same opinions and views, because we clearly don't. And actually, that's part of the richness of an academic environment. And so this is very ongoing work that includes kind of all sorts of training and what have you, but actually it's more about a very MIT word that we like to use, which is mens et manus, mind in hand, thinking and doing, ideas of action. So yes, there may be training, but it's about what we do every day that I think really, really matters. And we found that our young students, that our staff of color, our students of color, faculty, have been incredibly helpful and powerful as allies in all of this. That's exhausting work, and I want to recognize that, and the exhaustion that they feel, just like I sometimes feel like that in representing kind of my role as a very senior female leader in the organization. But it's been incredibly powerful to watch that allyship across these different communities. And I think this is actually something that is helping bring us together. I can get into way more nitty-gritty, but I won't do that yet.
Yes, yes, no, no, that's great. And I also want to encourage any of the alumni, faculty, staff, students that are on here to please continue to follow the work that we're doing, because we're going to be able to do in-person things soon, which is going to be great. We have a new shiny building that's going to be great. So please continue to follow us with that. I'm going to jump to one of our questions that was submitted by by hopefully an audience member, but they submitted it before the meeting. And I mean, we talked about this question, and I think that it's a really important one for us to answer. So I want to give a chance for all of you. Dereca, I'm going to have you kick us off about this question that is very common in white institutions, in white companies. And I think it's about the narrative of value, right? And the narrative of their meritocracy, which normally means the right dinner clubs and things like that, to our meritocracy, which is getting through Stanford while paying your mother's rent. And so this question is, how about a dedication to academic excellence? Is not the purpose of an MIT Sloan education to train students' minds to be good innovators, problem solvers, and managers of business? Because I'm the moderator, I'm going to keep my opinions to myself. And Dereca, you're going to hit a lot of what I'm thinking.
Well, thank you. So want to echo all the things that everyone has said before. This is such an important question because it exhibits a fundamental misunderstanding of what excellence is. There is this mental block that folks have around diversity and inclusion that I call diversity fatigue. And it's just an absolute, really, it's an absolute terror that what diversity and inclusion, what inclusion specifically means is less opportunity for those from majority identities, which is really quite ridiculous, because certainly the reason why people are marginalized is because there's been so much opportunity from folks from majority identities. But here's what's really important. Not only is the definition of excellence changing in the university, it's already changed in business, because we know more than we did. We know that diverse teams outperform teams that aren't diverse. 19% more innovation revenue, hundreds of millions more dollars, less turnover in the organization. There are quantifiable assets from a diverse team. Go to Harvard Business Review if you don't believe me, but there's tons of studies that talk about people who have innovative thinking are more prone to be from diverse backgrounds. So if I told you anything else could get you 19% more innovation revenue, you'd be majoring in that in business school. That would be your primary focus. What could get 19? But you don't want to hear it because it may mean sharing power and privilege that folks have had for so long. But it is going to require, when I teach managers, and I teach thousands of managers, I tell them, don't be the one who doesn't get it. You can't not get basic management anymore, and diversity and inclusion and belonging and equity are basic management. You'll fall behind if you stick with this idea that diverse is less than. You're already out of date just asking such a question, because what the business economy knows, right? And let me give you an example, because examples are more practical. So there was a time where I work with some folks in the outdoor industry. There was a time when people thought of the outdoor industry as almost exclusively male, right? And now Nike has a commercial that's about the strength of pregnant women. That wouldn't have happened 15 years ago. But what happens is when people get a seat at the table, it actually improves the outcomes for business. Now, I will say, and one of my students, Lily Zhang, is an incredible educator on this topic, trans woman who's done so much to push the boundaries. And what she says is the business case is morally bankrupt. Right? That we shouldn't actually do inclusion just because it makes more money. There's also the ethical case, which actually looks at the history of institutional oppression and says, yes, we're going to name it. We're going to say that women couldn't vote, that Black folks and BIPOC folks couldn't own property. We're going to actually talk about the oppression that contributes to inequality and inequity in the workplace, in academic institutions. We're not going to shrink away from it. That is the moment we're in right now. Why are we talking about this? Because the whole world is talking about it, because it is not only the problem of our day, it is the solution of our day. And if you want to call yourself innovative in business right now, then you have to get this. It's just like any other innovation. When we talked about fail fast, that blew people's mind. I was bred in Silicon Valley, right? People turned things up. There was a time when business dress meant a suit and a tie. And then a guy showed up in a hoodie and said, no, we're going to flip this whole thing around. That's how culture is created. Right? So if I show up in locks and I'm in leadership, then I say, this is okay, this is the norm. And you might be stuck back in the idea that
Dereca, am I the only one
Dereca.
who's lost Dereca's?
No, I think we've lost Dereca's audio.
Okay, yep, we've lost Dereca's audio. Dereca, try again. Try to talk again.
All
Yep,
right.
I can hear you again. Go ahead.
I apologize. It does say I got that little warning that my internet connection is unstable. Perhaps that means it's time for me to pause.
No, well, thank you. And, Dereca, a couple of things before I kick it to Fiona and then to Stanley. A couple of quick thoughts. My first thought is when I was at MIT in Dust, I was talking to a couple of, it was actually a Ferguson conversation. So it was like the whole school. And I had a chance to talk to a couple of undergraduates who are of color and who still had to fight like this idea that they were somehow an affirmative action case. And the kid looks at me and he's like, I got like a 4.2 and a 1600 on my SATs. Like, this is why I'm at MIT, right? Like, and I didn't even know you could get a 4.2 because I went to public school in Hawaii and we didn't have that. So I was like, oh my God, like that's incredible. And the second thought that I just want to throw your way is a quote by Kool Moe Dee. So Kool Moe Dee, for people who might not know, is this rapper from the 80s, and he really helped establish hip hop. I would consider him one of the founding people of hip hop, and he would wear cowboy hats and cowboy boots, and like he was still kind of on that disco thing. And someone asked him, they're like, Kool Moe Dee, like is cowboy hats hip hop? And he looked and he said, if I'm doing it, it's hip hop, right? Because I'm hip hop, right? And I think like that's where we need to go. Like if companies are doing it, it's because it's smart business. It's because, right? And not have to center it with the white gaze. So as you were talking about, I was just thinking about Kool Moe Dee being like, nah, this is it. This is what we do.
And there's all the research for people who need that. Right. And there is the ethical case, the business case, the personal case, right? Why it matters. I tell people all the time, I want you to think about the moment where women couldn't work. When you think about that moment, right? What do you think the conversation was among men, right? That had the power to make the decision. Women had earned the rights through their activism, which is why we can't be afraid of activism in corporate, right? This is how women got there. This is how people with disabilities got there, how people got domestic partnership. This is how it works. This is how corporations change. But there were people sitting there at that table going, but who's going to raise the children? And we don't have a bathroom for her. And what if she gets pregnant? What if she has the period? Like, these are things that but somebody had to say, I want this for my daughter, for my wife. Or people have gone to war and this is just good business. We need to figure this out. So there's a lot of reasons why change happens. This is a change management issue, right?
I think we know that when we have a diverse group of people in our organizations and we configure and our work and the ways in which we work and our ways of working and coming together well, that all that both the business case, the ethical case, the social, moral, individual case is made. I think that one of the pieces that ends up happening though is that this particular discussion about sort of, shouldn't we just choose everybody on the basis of merit, is all about how we get in the door, how we make sure that we actually have. And one of the conversations that I think has to be had and needs to just be had repeatedly is that if we just say, well, we've defined, there is this thing, existential sort of separate thing from the world that's called sort of merit and meritocracy, and it's some sort of set of, it's an algorithm, then of course we'd end up with a certain set of outcomes. And I feel like what we have to remind everybody is, all those criteria that we sort of call objective are of course neither objective nor are they fair, right? And that the way in which people are prepared for all these things, is even if we want to continue to use some of those measures, are things that we have to really ask ourselves very hard questions about. And I was really struck when I was doing some reading of undergraduate admissions folders, when I was reminded by our undergraduate admissions office that we shouldn't just look at what students have accomplished. We want to understand what the context is in which they've had those accomplishments. And so this, I think, comes back, I think, you know, to this point that's been made about whether what you've had to do in order to even make all these accomplishments to get into college, and people who are so resilient and resourceful that, you know, if kids come from incredibly good elite high schools, they've had every opportunity served up in front of them relative to kids who haven't. And so you have to sort of think about the context in which their accomplishments have happened. And this is not to say that you, and so this idea of bars being lowered and this, that, and the other, I think is a very problematic language. And this idea of sort of meritocracy in some narrow sense, and these measures that themselves are sort of constructed in very particular ways, I think is just us to think about the system, not just these individual pieces of the process. And I don't know whether that's the right way of talking about it, but for me, I think I keep having this conversation, and I wish I could be more eloquent and wonder how I ought to talk about it to be more useful.
True. It's true. And, you know, Fiona, you bring up a really good point. And for some reason, I'm sitting in music, y'all. So y'all going to get music references from me. You know, but often, right, it's like, you'll look at like J-Lo, Beyonc, you'll be like, oh my God, they're so beautiful, da 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 da. And then it's like, right, if I had a chef, if I had a trainer, right, if I could spend $500 on my hair every time I wanted to go out of the house, I would be fly AF too, right? But I'm doing my own hair, I'm doing my own makeup, I'm
So
you know doing my workout in the house, right? And so you know, I'm more of a Beyonce light, right? Like that. And you know, I think it's so important for us to remember that what you're given is really critical to what it takes. So I love that idea of the context of the success, right? And what that shows for the resiliency of the candidates as well. Stanley, I'd love for you to jump in here.
Sure, I'd be happy to. I think when you talked about changes in the corporate culture around diversity and inclusion, you know, there's a lot that needs to be changed. But when we think about this issue, we need to put it into some kind of a historical context. How many people do you think know that the IBM company opened the first integrated manufacturing plant below the Mason-Dixon line in 1955? 10 years before the Civil Rights Act, the CEO of the company had the ability to bring 2,000 jobs to any state in the United States that wanted it. And he selected Kentucky. And when the governor said it would have to be a segregated plant, he said, well, then it'll probably be in California, because we will not open in Kentucky unless it's integrated. And because they wanted the jobs, and because he was able to exert that economic leadership, he opened, and the schools in Lexington, Kentucky were integrated in 1956. And that demonstrates leadership. Now, we've got a lot of corporate behavior that's bad behavior, from the Bernie Madoffs or back 100 or more years ago to the robber barons. But we really have to understand that if corporate leaders want to exert that leadership around diversity and inclusion, they can make a huge difference. And when we talk about academic institutions, they can not only change their own campus, but they can change the community. They can exert their influence on businesses, on not-for-profit institutions, on civil society, because they have a lot of strength and power, maybe not the same as a company like IBM did in the 1950s, but this is an opportunity to really demonstrate that you can change the dynamic through that leadership. There's a lot that we can criticize corporations about. And when we talk about something like health insurance, do we know that it was a US company, Macy's, in the year 1870 that offered free health care for all of their employees? Now, that was before government did, or that a company like American Express offered a pension plan to all of its employees in 1875, or that 450 companies offered 1 week of paid vacation in the first decade of the 20th century, at a time when if you worked for the state of Massachusetts, they were closed on Christmas, but you didn't get paid. If you worked for the state of California, you didn't get paid, or the state of New York. But companies can exert real leadership. And as Dereca pointed out, it's in their economic interest to do so, absolutely. But it's an opportunity to recognize the importance of real leadership. So we can change the dynamic on this issue about diversity and inclusion, but it's going to take real leadership. And it's going to have to get out in front of regulation or legislation and demonstrate that real leadership. All of the examples that I gave you about pension, health insurance, they weren't legislated or regulated, or opening a diverse workplace, or having a diversity policy adopted by a company in the year 1954. These are things that could be out in front of government regulation, and it will be beneficial to your bottom line if you do it, but don't wait, get out front.
That's right. And you know what I love about what you brought up, Stanley, as well, is that if you do it first, you can then set the narrative, right? So rather than having the regulators tell you what you're going to do, you set the table, you start taking the steps forward. And I think IBM was also, I believe, one of the first companies to have a white ally ERG, right? And so, they were bringing white folks to learn how to be allies together. And you can't say that IBM is not as successful, right? I mean, IBM built a thing that built a person in chess, right? These are smart people, right? This is a group of diverse, smart people. And
Maria, can I jump in with a random fact? So as I think one of the things I do when I put on my research sort of hat is think quite a lot about how we can understand and trace out some of the challenges and issues around diversity in our economy, particularly using data on patents and intellectual property. Much easier to do that around gender than any other dimensions, but just when we're doing this at massive data scale. But when you actually start, you can actually start to rank organizations, universities, regions, companies by inclusion in terms of just the fraction of women in their patents and in their portfolio. And interestingly, IBM comes out extremely high. So among corporations in the United States, they're in the top 3 of the large corporate producers of patents. And that's even when you account for the fact that they are in fields which have traditionally had very few women. So they're in computers and communications. And there's something research about this, that there's something about this very long-term commitment. I mean, it doesn't make the organization perfect, but trying to actually capture and measure some of this over the long run across lots of organizations, I think also shows us that even if we got caught up to the frontier of big corporations and best universities, we would make a lot of progress. But I think the whole point is also to move that frontier out considerably further. But I'm a big fan of measuring things.
Yes, no, and actually, I love that.
I want to go back to something that Dr. Litow said, because everything he talked about is the other level. I talked about diversity, inclusion, and belonging, but that's equity, right? Because just because everyone feels good doesn't mean they get paid the same, doesn't mean they have the same infrastructure that supports their identity and who they are and what the deeper embedded opportunities are to succeed. And I think what's critical about that, going back to what you talked about, Malia, is that it actually shifts what is considered successful. At elite institutions, we're starting to do away with some of the standardized tests because we realize they don't actually measure what we want to know about prospective students. And even as you talked about Beyonc, what is it to say, no, Lupita, right, is also beautiful, because rather than having everyone feel the pressure of, I have to meet this mold of who fits at this company, who has the executive presence, rather than having to do that, what if we reinvent the idea, right, of what is excellence? Because what we're learning is the measures we've used beforehand, they're shortcuts. Right? I tell people I love Stanford, but not every student from Stanford is the most qualified applicant for a job. Right? And so what if because my daughter, both her parents went to Stanford, but she went to Spelman College. And I asked them, do you know what Spelman College is? Because you may code that for not being elite, but she made a choice for belonging. She didn't want to have one day where she questioned whether her success would be limited by her race or her gender. Right? And people are making choices to affirm themselves. The question is, will your environment affirm them as well? not their deficiency, but will your environment recognize the value that they see in their identity, that we see in our identity? Whether it's a person with a disability, does your environment say we value you? Do you have forms that allow for more than 2 choices for gender? How are you saying we value you enough to respect the differences in the way you're going to show up in this workplace?
Yeah, I also think that there's an important here that there's a risk involved in any institution not getting out front on this issue. What we're finding out right now is that young people, the most talented, don't want to work for a company that doesn't understand these issues. Your ability to attract talent is going to depend on your ability to understand that failure in this regard is a risk. So it's a question of minimizing and eliminating that risk, maximizing the reward, and getting out front of this issue. One of the things we're learning about higher education these days is a number of people focusing in on the skills crisis have started to say a phrase that I find particularly disturbing: college doesn't matter. And that you could get a short-term credential or you could get a short-term badge, and whether it's coding or something else, and that you don't really need a higher education degree. Well, they're not saying that about their own children. They're not talking about that about their own families, because what we know is that a post-secondary degree in lifetime earning equals 84% more than just a high school diploma. So we have to stop this nonsense about it doesn't matter. It's about stimulating the kind of educational experiences that are going to be totally equitable and that everybody has to get, and that college does matter. And it is something that we have to break down the barriers and make sure that entree is there for all young people, regardless of their race or zip code or economic status.
Bringing the fire. They sure don't say that about they kids. Go ahead, Dereca, and then I'm just going to get us to our last closing question.
Okay. Yeah, I want to just sort of, be a little bit of a rebel here. Maybe college shouldn't matter as much as it does. But I think you're absolutely right. It's still considered the barrier, the indicator to intelligence. And it's not always. Right? It's not always the best predictor for success. We talk about in our company inclusive mindset, and it comes out of Carol Dweck's work on growth mindset, right? Where she said it wasn't actually just your, innate ability, it was your grit and determination, which is again why first gen and or low income students have something that's different. But I think that there is something to be said for challenging the elite infrastructure of educational institutions. And there is something to be said, we talk about the prison industrial complex and nonprofit industrial complex, but there is kind of an elite academic industrial complex, right? And we should be challenging that. At the same time, we're saying that access needs to be there because this is the structure that we're doing. And so what I like to say, people are so critical of millennials all the time. And what I like to say is they are rightly wanting to destroy the institutions that have created so much inequity and oppression. But they need to learn, we all need to learn what I call the inside-outside game. This is still the rule of law, right? This is still how things work. And we need to allow people to have an opportunity to do both, to enter and to challenge. Just wanted to say that.
I just wonder in that context, how we should think then about, MIT, I think, is one of the few, among the top whatever institutions that does not do legacy. And as a foreigner to this country, I must admit that I find the whole idea of legacy completely baffling. Why it is that, and especially even more baffling is if you did a PhD at an institution, it doesn't count. But if you went there as an undergraduate, that does count as legacy. That's even more interesting. It's like some legacies matter more than others. But why do we have that? And why isn't that more talked about and just argued that all that does is very visibly perpetuate all the things that we're talking about, and it's one of the things that I find to be a great source of it's just such a source of pride to me that at MIT we don't have that. I don't know whether Dereca at Stanford you do. I'm not sure. And at Columbia
Well,
or
it's
Duke,
we do, but it's being challenged. But I think sometimes we, we call things, to your point, baffling, but it's not baffling. This is actually how oppression works, right?
Right, it's not a bug in the system, right? It's a feature.
It's there, right?
Maybe
this is the mechanism for oppression, right?
Right,
and
I think
make sure we insulate folks who already have power, right?
So maybe we should be baffled by why MIT doesn't have it.
Oh, well,
right.
So we got to change somewhere.
I think, Dereca, I'm just going to pull us back here because we're going to get to closing. But, I think what I hear everyone saying, right, is that power structures protect themselves, right? I mean, that's the role, that's how you maintain power, right? And I know, like I often say when we're shocked about George Floyd, or we're shocked about this, or we're shocked about that, that it's, again, it's a feature of the system. It's not a bug, right? Needing to oppress Black bodies was how we built this country, and that's our systems, and what's great, I think, is that it's not only people of color. White folks also, the millennials, don't want to work in all white environments, right? That we're having the largest generational wealth transfer coming down, and these are folks who don't want to go into a don't want to go into a white shoe, like type of firm the way their parents did, right? They're not building buildings with their name on them in order to get credit. So, the last question here, and I'm going to ask all of us to just be a little brief with time. I do want to talk about international students. I mean, so much, we have problems internally in America that have to do with our own indigenous populations, but especially in higher ed, international students. I mean, that's where we're going for the money, right? That's where we're going to make all of this work. And so I would love if each of you, and Stanley, we'll start with you, and then Dereca and Fiona will go in that order. If you can talk about how we can create more space for middle and lower income international students to be able to come to the universities.
Well, first of all, we have to recognize that the pandemic has really put a really serious thorn in the side of international students coming to the United States. So we really have to be much more aggressive in turning this situation around. And I think part of it will involve collaboration with non-governmental organizations, civil society, to be able to make sure that they're getting that message out in the geographies where they're operating. Our higher education institutions can't do this on their own by themselves. They need collaborators and partners who have that kind of contact with international students to let them know, A, that it's safe, and B, that it's an opportunity and then the institution has to put in place the support structures that are going to make sure that those young people who come here as international students do feel welcome, that they have a mentor, that they have another student who can be their collaborator and partner. This is something that our higher education institutions can mobilize one of the most important resources they have, which is their student population. And they can be interns, they can be mentors, they can be friends. They can provide that kind of support in a way that an institution can't. We have federal dollars under federal college work study, and it pays 70% of the salaries of students who do internships. Where do those students work? They work in the library, they work in the cafeteria, they do basic work. Those work-study jobs can be the internships that will welcome low-income students from the United States and internationally into the institution, and use that federal funding to pay the salaries of those interns so that we can create that support network. I think one of the things that we definitely have to do is mobilize the student population at these institutions to support this population in a way that the institution is never going to be able to do on their own. So we have to think about these things in creative and innovative new ways.
That I actually can just say, yes, I echo most of what was said. I think it's important whenever you're trying to serve a community to listen to the community. And the best way to find out how to work with students from middle and low income communities internationally is actually talk to them about what they need and how to serve them, because we always come up with these things and these measures and these ideas. And what do the mentors look like? Perhaps the jobs are jobs in the labs, perhaps they're research opportunities, perhaps they're fellowships, right? Like you said, some of these communities that are highly resourced care very much about access for their middle and low income students. And sometimes you have whole countries, right, where the preponderance of students from those countries are middle and low income. And so they're complex issues because international, like any other identity, is huge. What that means, right, in the Philippines is very different than what it means in Ghana, right? And so we have to actually understand that we can't have this big lump, but at the same time, I wholeheartedly agree with the mentor idea and the way in which we can engage communities in their own agency of how to better serve them. So I think that was it. And I do want to just also plus one, Dean Murray, I do want to say I knew exactly what you meant by baffling. And so I just really wanted to sort of tease it out to say, yeah, I agree with you. It is disturbing, right? But I think it's always important for us to talk about how the status quo perpetuates itself. And I know that was your intent. So I just want to echo that idea there.
You're muted, Fiona.
Sorry, Malia, my dog was, my puppy was going slightly crazy, so I put myself on mute to spare everybody from that. So first I want to say thank you. This is such an enlightening conversation for me. I mean, each one of these conversations has been enlightening. This one, of course, especially so because we're talking about the thing that I think about all the time and want to make an enormous difference. The international question is obviously particularly personal for me as somebody who came to the United States. I came here for graduate school, which is true of so many, actually, of our faculty. In fact, it's quite frequent that you go into a meeting here at MIT among faculty, and at least half the people in the room have some sort of foreign accent of some description, and do not sound like they were born in the United States, and frankly, were not. And so I think it's really important, and it brings, I think, a richness and a difference in perspective if we can do that. At the graduate level, certainly we see that in our MBA classrooms with our mid-career people, and in addition with our undergraduates. I think for undergraduates, some of the ways in which we engage young people, probably we have even more of a duty of care because, of course, they're so incredibly young and very, very far from home. I think when we think about it, particularly in the professional context, there are two things that I think are really important. One is to sort of remember that people come with their own, everybody's country comes with its own version of diversity, equity, and inclusion challenges. And their own fault lines in terms of who feels included and who is not. And those things may be different in each country, and appreciating what that looks and feels like when we bring international students in. And we, in a sense, particularly at the moment, they get immediately immersed in the American story of diversity, equity, and inclusion, often without its historical context. And I think that actually can be very, very confusing. It can be quite frightening. People don't quite understand, and they're also very worried they're going to get it wrong. And just appreciating, and especially for our students, for example, from sub-Saharan Africa, who of course are African but not African-American, they are from very, very different cultures. They often get sort of assumed to be of a certain, sort of have certain cultural practices and sort of be parts of certain communities where they may or may not feel a sense of belonging. And I think we just need to be sensitive about that, both to give people the context of the country that they've chosen to come to, appreciate the differences in their own lived experience of sort of diversity and inclusion and lack of inclusion, and not feeling like they belong, not always feeling welcomed here into the United States, and really hope that we actually can do that in a way that causes all this sort of extraordinary positive outcomes of having this additional dimension of diversity. I think that's a lot of work to do because it requires a lot of explaining, actually, I think. But when you can get it right, it's very rich. And when we can make sure that people have the space to express their views, but understand it's within the boundaries of what we consider to be okay to talk about. And you can ask questions, but there are some basic fundamental beliefs that we have here about what is right and good. and where we're working towards these conversations. So, you know, I think there's a lot to be done, but when we get it right, it can be so rich and positive. But I think it adds a dimension of difficulty and challenge, but one that is really so very, very productive. So, Millie, thank you for asking that question. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you. And thank you to all of our panelists. Fiona, I loved having you on the panel. It was great to hear your thoughts and not just your questions. It was wonderful. And thank you, Dereca. Thank you, Stanley, for joining us. And thank you to all of you who have been participating in these conversations. You know, it's great to go out with us thinking about ourselves and learning about examples of how we can change, because as one of my gurus says, when you become enlightened, that's when the world becomes enlightened. So we need to work on ourselves. So thank you, everybody. I appreciate it. And we will see you in the fall.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you all. And Malia, thank you so much for leading us through these conversations. They have been incredible fun, and I have learned an immense amount, and I'm so appreciative. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
you.
Thank you all.
Bye,
Thank
everyone.
you, Dereca. Thank you, Stanley. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thanks, Dean Murray. Thanks, Malia.